I have a working theory that my ancestor was an Anglo-Saxon, migrated to England in the 4th and 5th century AD, when the Anglo-Saxons came over in waves over 150 years. My working theory is that eventually the ancestor that came to the Virginia colony in 1700 was from Shropshire, which is on the border of England and Wales, in the area that would have been considered Western Mercia. Mercia was primarily settled by Angles, which were in the northwestern part of Germany, just below Denmark. I have no documentation that would prove any of this, so I turned to YDNA to see what I could find out. I took the YDNA test through Family Tree DNA, and they test various markers. The more markers you test, the more accurate the test results are. And at the time, I took the highest marker test, which was 111, and these are my matches. The number of steps determines how closely you are related to that person. So on the surface, it would look like David is my closest relative, followed by James and Charles. David's ancestor, the furthest he knew back, was Amos in 1861. James and Charles, they believe that their earliest known ancestor lived in Gloucester County, Virginia, which is one of the peninsulas in the Chesapeake Bay. My ancestor, Edward Bromlow, lived in Richmond County, which was on another peninsula adjacent to the Gloucester County. And today, Gloucester County is now known as Matthews County. It split, and where their ancestor lived is now in Matthews County. Since lately, you can take a higher level test, a 700 marker test through YDNA, which fine-tunes the relationships even more. And what it does is it identifies the various subclades. So the subclades are these little forks in the branch, these little small mutations. And following the branches, which would lead you to perhaps to another fork, you can see more precisely how individual people are related. Once you're tested in the big Y DNA test, Family Tree DNA has some pretty interesting tools that you can use to analyze the results. One is the match time tree, and what that does is it takes all the people that have tested and plots their subclade on these branches, these subclades, so you can start to see how the different people that are matched are related. Here you see the subclade S263, and all of these people are descendant from that one subclade that existed around 2600 BCE. Over on the far right are all the different people that are matched, all the people that have tested. So these are current people that have tested using the Big Y 700 test, and where they fit on these different branches. And as we scroll down toward the bottom, we get to where my results are. So the previous screen where I was showing you the different matches that I was most closely related to, this is where they fall on the subclade tree. And I can see that they are all linked to this one common ancestor that branched off a little bit differently than I did. So I have, my ancestors did not branch from this subclade, the 2340 subclade, but these descendants did, and they are related to a common ancestor that was a descendant of this common ancestor. They branched off sometime between this range. They're predicting that it's 1798 is when they actually branched off. We're all related to this one common ancestor that is estimated to have been born around 1739, but it's within a range, so it could be as early as 1700, maybe a little bit before. So that seems to indicate perhaps that they were a descendant of Edward Brumlow. I know who the children of Edward Brumlow were. He had one son and two daughters. There is a little bit of mystery as to whether or not there might have actually been a second son, because the recorded children of Edward Brumlow was that his son's name was Edward, but later the descendants and the person who inherits his land is named Isaac. So we don't really know if Isaac was just another name for young Edward, or if there were actually two sons and Isaac was not recorded in the North Farnham Parish Baptismal Registry. But we can see that they are more closely related than I am, and David is more closely related to James and Charles than the Y111 marker DNA test would have suggested. I'm currently talking with another relative that I believe will fall more closely in this. He will be getting tested soon, so I'm waiting to see how he falls within this tree. All of us, though, are related to the 152525 subclade that is estimated to have been born around 1337 CE. So that's about the time I believe that we were in Shropshire, near a small hamlet called Bromlow Callow, which is where we got our name. And it's not far from Shrewsbury. Our family's going to be visiting there soon, and I'll cover more of that then. I have a working theory that we were Angles, not Saxons. However, because of this big Y 700 DNA test, I now believe that we were Saxons. The reason that I thought we were Angles was that our surname was Bromlow, which is a very rare surname, and it originated in just one place in England, in a small hamlet of Bromlow, which is on the Welsh border, in the Welsh Marches in Shropshire, southwest of Shrewsbury. And that sits in Mercia, the kingdom of Mercia, and Mercia was primarily settled by Angles. Now, the subclade that we were a common ancestor of lived around 305 is when the mutation occurred. Anglos and the Saxons started invading, migrating to Britain after the Romans left in 479 AD. It started off with invasions, but there were also migrations over the next 150 years. Most of the Angles settled in northern England and central England, and the Saxons settled in southern England. However, it wasn't as simplistic as that. There were some Angles that lived in southern England and some Saxons that lived in central England, but the majority was Angles in the mid and northern sections of England and Saxons in the southern. Also notice that there was a 1,000-year span between the time they arrived in England and when I think they ended up in Shropshire. And a lot can happen in 1,000 years. So to understand how I have come to believe we were Saxons is the way they were able to trace our migration was as they would discover ancient remains, burial remains, and dig them up, they would test the YDNA, and they would discover that this particular individual had this subclade, and they fell within our tree. And by plotting, carbon dating and plotting the subclades, they were able to create a route of how we migrated out of Africa and ended up in Scandinavia. One of these ancient remains is called Oxford Tin Man, number 10. And he was a Dane that had branched off from our subclade and stayed in Denmark and was from a much older branch, so very distant cousin, so to speak. He was found in a mass grave on Oxford campus, and this was a grave of the Danes that had been massacred on the St. Brice Day. All across England, the king had ordered the Danes to be slaughtered. I'm going to be visiting Oxford and visiting the site where this recent discovery took place. But next I'm going to show you another tool that Family Tree has where they plot all these ancient remains to try to show our migration path. This is Family Tree's Global Tracker, which is a migration map that shows the route that our subclade took out of Africa and where we ended up prior to invading England. Everyone started out in Africa, the Homo sapiens, in this area. So this is Y Adam, and this is the route that the Homo sapiens took out of Africa. And every so often there would be such a deviation in the branch that it would form a new haplogroup. Our haplogroup is I. So we crossed the Sinai Peninsula, going across southern Saudi Arabia, crossing over into what would become Persia, now Iran, on the western coast, going through Iraq, going through southern Anatolia, and southern Anatolia, another branch that broke off a different haplogroup, settled in Anatolia, and they would take a different migration route and they would go into Great Britain, and they were the Bronze Age inhabitants of Britain. Another haplogroup that settled around Austria were known as the Celts. They had come from the steppes, ended up around Austria, and they continued to migrate into France, Spain, and also into Britain, and started to replace or push back the original inhabitants of Britain and became the Celtic people. Rome would have invaded in the southern part of England, and they would start to push back the Celtic tribes. And then after the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons started migrating in. So that's what we're trying to connect with. So from Turkey, we went toward the Baltic Sea, crossing the Bosphorus Strait near Istanbul, going up into Ukraine, into the Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, and along the way they had dipped down in between Hungary and Austria, but then came back up. As the Ice Age approached, they started going down south to Spain. As the Ice Age retreated, they started going back up and settled into Scandinavia and the area that became known as Saxony. You see here was the I-263. That was the starting subclade branch that we talked about in the time-matched tree, where you can see all the different branches. The common ancestor that we ended up with before we migrated into England was the BY 152-520, and that ancestor lived in what is now Saxony, which is why I now believe that we were Saxons and not Angles. Our ancestor that migrated from England to the Virginia colony around 1699, he died in Richmond County, Virginia in 1717. I believe that he came from Shropshire. So let's follow the path. This is a interactive playback. I'm going to click play so you can see how the migration took place. You'll also notice that there'll be some red branches where some of our siblings kind of branched off, but our specific subclade continued on up until they ended up in Saxony. This blue area is the broad migration path that our subclade, those that stayed behind in Saxony and did not migrate into England, they spread east into Germany and then into Poland. So I'm going to start the playback now. So as you can see, where our ancestor BY 152-520 landed, this is in Germany. Here's Bremen. Here's Hamburg. Up here is Denmark. Now, our I Haplogroup did come up into Denmark, and then migrated down south into Schleswig-Holstein, this is the area that was considered the Angles. And the Saxons were in this area. So we're like squarely right in the middle of Saxony. How do I reconcile the fact now that I know that we were Saxons and that Mercia was primarily Angles? How do I handle that contradiction? The early maps indicate that Angles, which is in this area just below Denmark, came in and moved into Northumbria and Mercia, which Brumlo-Calla would have been right around where the is, and that the Saxons came into southern England, and the Jutes came into the very south of England. But if you look at a map of Britannia around 530 AD, well into the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and see where they're actually settled, you see that the Jutes in the dark green are in Kent, and also in this area, which would have been around where Wessex would have been. And you see that, but there also are the Saxons are not only in the south, which is what the traditional maps, simple maps, kind of indicate, but they're also in the central part of Britannia as well. The Angles are on the east coast. Eventually they will continue to trickle in, and they will end up dominating this area. But in the beginning, you could see that it could be easy for our ancestor to have perhaps come in this area, or even landed here, but ended up in this area through the rivers migration. And they could end up being in the western area, and so in a good position to end up in this area where I believe that the surname Brumlo originated. This was like the Severn River, and so Brumlo-Calla would have been right around this area. This tan area is the Britons that have been pushed back as the Anglo-Saxons are migrating. Not all of the Britons left their areas and pushed back. Some stayed and then mixed in with the Anglo-Saxons. But a lot of them did kind of fall back, and they're kind of caught in between the Celtic tribes of Wales and the Angles and the Saxons that are pushing in, either through invasions or just migration. Another force that could have pushed our ancestor more west towards the Welsh borders was in the 800s, the Vikings, raiders primarily from Denmark, were invading, and they were primarily coming in from the north and kind of the central part of England. Wessex was the only kingdom that was able to resist with the help of Mercia as well. Mercia used to incorporate this whole section, but they've been pushed back as well. So there's even more pressure to be pushed back towards Wales, just like the original Britons were when the Anglo-Saxons invaded. So I think it is very conceivable that even though our ancestor was a Saxon, that they could end up in the area around the Welsh Marches, which, even though that's technically considered Mercia and primarily was Angles, is very plausible that they could be Saxon and also end up in Shropshire.